This week's case study focuses on Hemlock woolly adelgid. This is a major insect outbreak in the eastern United States that affects eastern hemlock. And so here's our subject, Hemlock woolly adelgid. It is an aphid-like insect. It's actually, in this photograph, hidden under those white, kind of cottony shapes that you see at the base of the needles there on eastern hemlock. The insect is actually in there. That is the white woolly egg sac that gives the insect its name. The insect's in there, and it's actually protected by that woolly substance. Hemlock woolly adelgid is a major insect outbreak. The insect is exotic in the range of eastern hemlock. It was initially introduced in the 1950s, and we'll talk about its spread into wildlands. Now, before we talk about the insect, we should highlight some things about eastern hemlock. If you're familiar with western hemlock species, you probably realize that these are very shade-tolerant trees, and in the eastern United States, where there is a greater mix of broad-leaved species, hemlock provides a very unique kind of biodiversity, both locally and within the landscapes. These high shade tolerance of eastern hemlock creates a unique understory environment within eastern forests. Hemlock is also has acidic foliage that creates a low pH forest floor and mineral soil that's associated with it. And when you compare that to adjacent broadleaf forests, such as those that are dominated by sugar maple, red oaks, or red maple, the biogeochemistry of these forests is quite unique. Their eastern hemlock forests are important for a number of different wildlife species. One of the reasons for that is because that high shade tolerance and the evergreen nature of hemlock creates deep shading. These stands hold on to their snowpack longer, and they also, kind of ironically, but they can be areas that are better protected from wind and occasional extreme low temperatures in the region. I should say extreme low temperatures for the region, which can be substantially cold and threaten various kinds of wildlife. But the stands are unique, particularly when you contrast them with other hardwood forests in New England. That shade tolerance and the unique chemistry of foliage is affecting both all aspects of the stands and their structure. Here's another photograph. You can see sort of a depauperate understory that's different than some of the other forests that I'll show you in a little bit, especially once they've been impacted by adelgid. These are deeply shaded, cool forests, and like I say, they are unique when you contrast them with other forests in New England. Eastern hemlock forests are also tend to have a unique land use history within the region. Most of New England was cleared for agriculture and plowed or converted into pastures. However, eastern hemlock tends to dominate lower areas, sometimes wetter areas that were poor places on the landscape for agriculture. And because of that, when you look at the heyday of land clearance in New England, which was most of the landscape, oftentimes eastern hemlock stands are remnant pockets of forest that were uncleared during the peak of landscape clearance in New England. So as I say, in about 1950, this insect was introduced to the range of eastern hemlock. Eastern hemlock is disjunct from western hemlock species. And kind of one of the interesting things about Hemlock woolly adelgid is that it was first described in western hemlock. It was just kind of described as a fairly innocuous insect herbivore in in western hemlock forests, and it wasn't really recognized as being a problem until it emerged as a major source of mortality in eastern hemlock. In western forests, the insect, it's part of our insect fauna in western forests, but it rarely kills trees. I have read reports of occasional outbreaks on individuals. Probably kills a tree here and there, western hemlock, a Suga heterophila individual here and there, but it's not a major pest. Now, what's interesting about this insect is it turns out evidence suggests that the insect itself is exotic to western hemlock forests. So if that's true, that would suggest that throughout North America, the insect is exotic, but in the West, it's really not that big of a pest, but in the East, it's very damaging. So here's another photograph of the insect. It's mobile for only one part of its life cycle. After the eggs hatch, the insects are mobile and they'll crawl around. They crawl out and attach at the base of the needle, and then insert a long stylus and feed on ray parenchyma cells. So they they're basically feeding at a much relatively deep in the tissues of eastern hemlock relative to the size of the insect. It's thought that the insect may introduce a toxic saliva into eastern hemlock, which causes some of the deterioration of plant health. These are insects that have just recently crawled out and attached themselves to individual needles, and that's why we can see them. The insect is actually the black thing there. The insects, once they attach, they are no longer mobile. They are fixed, and they do exude that white woolly waxy material that encloses their eggs, but once they attach, essentially they're there for good. Now, the crawler stage is remarkably, has a pretty good dispersal. The insects attach themselves or crawl onto birds. They crawl down along the length of stems and twigs. They attach themselves to people and so forth, and they're able to get out into the landscape and cause problems. And so here's our insect again on eastern hemlock, and you can see once again that of course the insect is no longer mobile. It has attached itself to the base of the twigs, and you get the characteristic white woolly egg sac. Now, this is how most people interact with the insect, and it's oftentimes misdiagnosed as a disease. And I have sympathy for people who initially look at this and think, oh, it's a disease rather than an insect, because this does look like what a lot of ascomycetes might do, just kind of a slimy stuff. It's not so much slimy, but it's just kind of a weird growth on the twigs, and if you smash it, then it's got some slimy stuff on the inside. Like I say, this is how most people interact with this insect in the field, and the rates of the insect population growth are very substantial. The feeding of the insect increases the loss of individual needles, accelerating needle loss by several years. So typically, eastern hemlock is able to hold on to its needles for 3 to 5 years, and with feeding by this insect, that the loss of needles is much more rapid. So let's talk about spread of the insect in the forest that we're most concerned about. Again, we're talking about the eastern United States. We know enough about the insect and its dispersal modes, its dispersal distances, and its resilience to the environment to be able to say something about what areas are at risk and why it has spread in the way that it has. So here's a recent model that is contrasting the observed spread of the insect relative to what we would expect given what we know about the biology of the insect. And Hemlock woolly adelgid is an interesting case. Well, first off, I should say that the distribution of the insect that you're seeing on this map is greatly influenced by the distribution of hemlock. This Hemlock woolly adelgid is a host-specific insect. At least in eastern North America, it's only known to feed on eastern hemlock and Carolina hemlock, two very closely related species. And so a lot of the distribution here is reflecting the distribution of eastern hemlock. But what's interesting about this model, it's really helpful analysis, is it's showing that the areas that were invaded first by the insect, the insect was initially introduced into Richmond, Virginia, outside of the range of eastern hemlock, and then spread into wildland hemlock forests, which are more prominent in the Appalachian Mountains. So even though the initial introduction was kind of isolated, it took some amount of time for the insect to escape back, its initial introduction area and get into wildlands. But what we see is that some areas here were invaded more quickly than we would expect based on the biology, and some areas have been invaded more slowly than we would expect based on the biology. And the map is showing, what we're seeing here are that green areas were invaded more slowly than expected, whereas red areas were invaded more rapidly than expected. One of the major factors which influences the dispersal and the establishment of this insect are winter temperatures, winter minimum temperatures. Essentially, the most important factor in determining the spread of the insect is how well it survives freezing conditions over winter. So very cold winters with low snowfall, because snow can be insulating. Low snowfall winters with distinct cold snaps are very damaging to the populations of this insect. That's a positive if you are a land manager trying to deal with hemlock mortality. A cold winter is a positive for you. And it's a major factor controlling the dispersal and establishment of the insect. However, the other thing that this map and model suggests is that prevailing wind patterns, which come from the southwest and generally tend towards the northeast, are dispersing the insect into areas that we would expect to be invaded more slowly, because even though they are colder, and specifically the New England portion of this landscape is colder than the southern Appalachian Mountains, the areas have been, the New England was invaded more rapidly, was invaded prior to the more southern distribution of hemlock. Now, even though it took Hemlock woolly adelgid quite a bit longer than we expect for it to get established in the southern Appalachians, unfortunately, as soon as the insect did arrive, it has been extremely destructive, probably because there is less control on the insect's populations in the southern part of eastern hemlock range than in New England. In New England, every couple of years, and this is going to be true for the 2017-2018 winter, low temperatures are damaging to the insect populations, and that slows the rate of spread. Obviously, it has not restricted spread because mortality by this insect is extensive in New England, particularly along the coast of Connecticut. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, as soon as the insect did get established in the Appalachian Mountains, mortality of hemlock was quite rapid, despite that it had been a refugia for the insect for some time. Now, let's talk about what kind of effects the insect has on on wildland forests. As insect populations build up, we see a thinning of the canopy, and recall that one of the really unique things about hemlock is that it's highly shade tolerant. You have deeply shaded canopies, lots of overlap within the canopy, and the insect changes all that. It starts to thin canopies, increasing light interception at the forest floor. Trees die fairly rapidly within, it's not exactly particularly well estimated, but somewhere between 4 to 8 years prior to initial infestation. That number probably is greatly dependent on the initial population levels. But the tree canopy's thin, trees are killed, and this alters, as I say, the understory conditions, and we see prolific regeneration. In New England, particularly, we see prolific regeneration of black birch. This is a shade-intolerant broadleaf species that is very good at regenerating in the deep forest floors of eastern hemlock forests. So by changing the microclimate conditions, Hemlock woolly adelgid is dramatically shifting species composition within these forests. These are very dense, very different ecologically speaking, very different forest conditions. Again, eastern hemlock is valuable for contributing to landscape level biodiversity, and black birch, while it's there are some really great things about black birch, we're losing that kind of landscape biodiversity by so greatly increasing the prevalence of this species. Don't get me wrong, black birch, there's a lot of positives about black birch, but the landscape is being altered. As I mentioned, black birch is a shade-intolerant species. It's fast-growing. It has about the same timber value as eastern hemlock, but its foliage decomposes very rapidly. The forest floor conditions change rapidly in these forests, and it's just very substantial ecological changes. Some of the other impacts of Hemlock woolly adelgid is an increase in coarse woody debris and fuels. These are not particularly fire-prone forests that are being impacted by this insect, but there's certainly a lot of changes in the dead wood dynamics. This doesn't necessarily necessitate a management response to address the fuels, but there can be some other impacts on wildlife associated with this kind of woody debris accumulation. And this photograph is just to emphasize once again just how dense these stands become. It's not fully clear what they will develop into, but certainly black birch will grow rapidly for up to about a century. It does have a lot of decay organisms, but I see no reason to think that these stands will not remain as black birch dominated. And because of that, all aspects of their ecology will reflect the characteristics of black birch and broadleaf forests in general, meaning that there will be more rapid growth, there will be more light interception in the forest floor, particularly in the winter when the leaves are off. That should change snowpack levels and affect the kinds of the habitat quality for certain wildlife, particularly likely to have a negative impact on those wildlife that are dependent on the unique conditions of hemlock. So once again, this is Hemlock woolly adelgid is truly a region scale forest mortality issue. It is being caused by an invasive insect, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good management responses to this insect now that it is established. Insecticides are not particularly effective, probably because the insect is protected in that white woolly egg sac, And it's so broadly distributed and located in so many different places, including sensitive habitats such as urban areas and other places where we do not want to apply insecticides. We've got a serious problem and that we're going to have a terrible time addressing. Eastern hemlock is greatly in decline within the region. There's so much mortality has occurred, we can't undo that. And it really leaves people like myself wringing our hands trying to understand what we should be doing in order to make these forests more resilient and protect the biodiversity that's associated with hemlock. At present, there are some suggestions for increasing stand diversity. Hemlock stands, of course, can tend to be monodominant, and there have been some suggestions that increasing stand diversity might protect individual hemlock. That makes a lot of sense to me from an epidemiological perspective. This is a host-specific insect, and once eastern hemlock is gone from a stand, the insect cannot persist. That would suggest that isolated hemlock and mixed stands may escape the insect attack by the insect just by chance that they're more difficult for the insect to find and establish on. That's those kinds of silvicultural solutions, changing stand diversity and doing some things to protect stands, particularly where eastern hemlock is at lower abundance, could be potentially helpful. But in the areas where arguably hemlock has the most value, and these monodominant stands that are unique characteristics of the landscape, unfortunately, we have not yet come up with a good solution. And if you're interested in this, I would emphasize that there's a lot of opportunity for dealing with this particular insect outbreak and insect outbreaks like it. What do we do from a management perspective in order to protect the resources that we care about that are being impacted in cases like Hemlock woolly adelgid?